Despite coaching losses, Notre Dame recruiting is not going anywhere, and in fact, it's going to improve.
Locked On presents The Portal, the daily podcast covering college football recruiting and everything NIL. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome back into The Portal. I am your host, Brian Smith, longtime college football recruiting analyst and writer. Thank you for making The Portal your first listen each and every day. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here, and there's no better way to make every play more exciting within FanDuel Sportsbook. New customers can bet $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. Download the app or head over to FanDuel.com to get started. As I said in the open, Notre Dame recruiting is not going anywhere, and here's why. Number one is Marcus Freeman. He is a dominant recruiter and one of the best, if not the best, head coaches in the business on the recruiting trail. Plus, let's be honest, going to the national championship game is going to give Notre Dame a lot of shine. That's going to help with a lot of prospects across the nation, and in fact, they've already made inroads in California, Texas, Florida, and several other hotbeds across the country. Notre Dame recruiting is only going to get better. To help me discuss Notre Dame and the portal and everything else they got going on, my guy Tyler from Locked On Irish. Tyler, what's going on, man? How you been doing?
Not much. I've been doing good, man. I think now I've fully embraced the fact that we are in the offseason. Notre Dame was able to keep me away from offseason content for as long as humanly possible, but it's here and I'm ready to dive into it.
It is really interesting because you got coaching changes. Right before we did this show, I saw that Dylan McCullough, he's going to head over to the Raiders to be the new running backs coach. You got Chad Bowden going to USC. Even those things, I still don't think Notre Dame's going to take a big back seat, and I want to talk about that. In my first question to you, where do you think Notre Dame made the biggest impact in recruiting this year with the 25 class? Is it holistic? Is it a player? Whatever you want to talk about.
It does seem like they have a better sense of the direction that they're going to try to go to in the future. This is Marcus Freeman's third class as the head coach. And I think when you look at it, all these guys are Notre Dame fits. Now, they were able to branch out a little bit. They got some big-time athletes like Dallas Golden, who you and I have talked about a ton in the past. So excited about his potential. And it was good to finally get a player from Berkeley Prep because Notre Dame had prioritized that school in the past. They came up short with Keon Keeley. But I guess if there's anything to take away from that Keon Keeley recruitment, it's that it led them to Dallas Golden. So I felt like this class built on their strengths. They've been really good at defensive back ever since Mike Bickens came over. This was a great haul in the secondary, even without Ivan Taylor. And then you got another great offensive line class headlined by Will Black. And I think it's just kind of typical. Notre Dame expects to get the best offensive lineman in the country, and Will Black is such an intriguing prospect because, not only is he a high 4-star, borderline 5-star according to some sites tackle, he's also a great athlete. Notre Dame is basically an embarrassment of riches in that offensive line room. So they built on their strengths, but I would like to see them improve on some of those weaknesses in the future.
Yeah, I think that wide receiver and defensive tackle recruiting are the two that you're referring to the most, if I was to guess. So let's tackle that within itself. Notre Dame didn't throw the ball very well this past year, and I'm being kind. But they had some moments. In the national title game, it actually was one of the reasons they made their comeback, which I know it surprised me. I'm assuming it has surprised you a little bit too. What do they have to do to get over the top, though, with wide receiver recruiting? Like, what do you see?
I think it's a couple things, but the thing that will help them out the most is if any of their wide receivers, but specifically Jaden Greathouse. If Jaden Greathouse really breaks out, he carries whatever momentum he built in those last two games of the season, the two most important games of the season, if he can carry that into next season and be a true wide receiver one, I think that will go such a long way for Notre Dame wide receiver recruiting. If it ends up being Malachi Fields, I'll certainly take it. I'll take any big-time wide receiver. But considering he's a transfer from Virginia, I think it will mean a little bit more if Jaden Greathouse, a homegrown kid, someone that they literally stole away from Texas, went to one of the biggest high school programs in the state of Texas, if he comes to Notre Dame and becomes, a future high draft pick after this season, like if this is his last year at Notre Dame, he ends up getting drafted in, let's say, the first 3 rounds of the NFL, like that will go so far because when Notre Dame recruits these wide receivers, Mike Denbrock was showing them clips of his offense at LSU. I get it. They had Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas Jr. So that I understand why Denbrock would show high school recruits those guys, but it's just not going to hit the same when they're wearing a different uniform. So I think that these wide receivers at the high school level, they want to see proof that they can go to this school, be developed, and become an NFL draft pick. And frankly, Notre Dame hasn't had that since Chase Claypool, and that was back in 2019.
That is true. They've had some decent receivers, but it's been balanced, and the tight end room has carried the water for the Irish for quite some time. On that, the defensive tackle situation, I don't think it's as much about performance as it is dollar bills. NIL and D-tackle go hand in hand because they're for the give or take 70 schools in the Power Four. There are probably about 20 that they all want. It's just math. So, and that math translates to dollar bills again. And Notre Dame doesn't like paying as much up front historically. However, they have changed on that a little bit. So let me throw this at you. Could you foresee Notre Dame going out and making a major run at one of these D tackles this year, next year, whatever, with a little more upfront NIL money?
I think they will. And I'm really interested to see how this revenue sharing ends up playing out, because I think that's going to be so critical for Notre Dame and how they approach NIL going forward. Because even though they're a lot more competitive in the NIL space, the number that's been reported recently is that this team that they just took to the national championship accounted for about $7 to $8 million. It's a pretty good number, but it's nothing compared to Ohio State, famously $20 million, or even Texas, who's probably closer to that $15 million range. Well, according to this revenue sharing model that we're still waiting to see if it gets passed, we're going to find out here pretty soon, but it would be $20.5 million for the entire athletic department. And Notre Dame's athletic director, Pete Bavacqua, has already come out and said the vast majority of that money is going to football. So if that would suggest that there's going to be an influx of money that the football program can use. And now that they have more than they had before, I think they'd be a little bit more willing to use that on high school recruits. And as you kind of alluded to, they're more than willing now than they were in years past to give that upfront money to high school recruits. And I think that if they have even more money coming in, they'll understand that, Howard Cross and Riley Mills, like those guys don't grow on trees. You're going to have to get them at the high school recruiting levels, and it's probably going to cost a little bit more money.
That's kind of where I'm in the boat. I think there's 2 or 3 kids. There's a couple from California, there's a kid from New Jersey, there's a kid from Texas, etc., and then a handful from the Midwest, whatnot, that they're really trying to get. One of them, it may come down to NIL money because these recruitment, Southern Cal, Texas A&M, Oklahoma, these kind of programs, they have their own cash flow. So if you're not competing at a high level for it, that's going to be pretty hard. Next, the position you feel Notre Dame really needs to get at a high level beyond the obvious. Obviously, D-line and receiver. Is there anything else they need to add, or is it just trying to put the cherry on top everywhere else?
I think you could say quarterback. Now, quarterback recruiting has certainly improved under Marcus Freeman. Kenny Minchie was basically a steal that they got him late. And I think he's a pretty underrated prospect. And even now that he's been on the team for 2 years, not many people give much of a shot. And it's because CJ Carr was the big borderline 5, so that they got really excited to see what he can do. They had Deuce Knight committed for a long time, and then he sort of strung them along, ended up flipping to Auburn. But they need to continue to close on those super high-end guys, because we all know that quarterback recruiting, it's a crapshoot. It's the same in the NFL draft. Guys get drafted in the first round and then they bust. There are 5 stars at the high school level who don't pan out in college. But the best way to get over that is just by bringing in more of those. So I think Blake Hebert is an interesting prospect, someone that Notre Dame was in on early. But I think, when you consider just how important the quarterback position is in college football, you got to keep trying to get those top of the line guys. They missed on Dante Moore. They got CJ Carr, but they missed on Deuce Knight. And they need to make a little bit more than they missed going forward.
Tyler brings up a good point about the key offensive position, and probably the most important position in all of sport. When we come back, I'm going to give my take on a defensive player that I think is going to make a major impact with the Irish. That is next here on The Portal. The big game is almost here, and there's no better way to make it even more exciting than with PrizePicks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With over 10 million members and billions in winnings awarded, PrizePicks makes it fun and simple to get in on the action. Here's how it works. You pick more or less on 2 players' projections, and if you're right, you could win up to 1,000 times your cash. PrizePicks even has a free pick for the big game where Patrick Mahomes only needs to throw for 1 yard to win. Pair that with 1 or more correct picks, and you're cashing out. This week, I'm looking forward to picking Travis Kelce on receiving yards and more for quarterback passing yardage. What I love most, fast, safe withdrawals. When I win, my cash is in the account in as little as 15 minutes. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONCollege to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's Locked On College for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game. Notre Dame is going to have another impact linebacker this next year in Madden Fariemo. If you haven't heard about him, the linebacker is an absolute stud. He's going to be a guy that comes in and plays right away, despite Notre Dame being loaded at linebacker. And this shows you why recruiting is so important. Competition breeds success. Marcus Freeman and his group have done a great job with that. And Tyler, I tell you what, Notre Dame in linebacker recruiting has been pretty awesome the last few years. Obviously, Marcus played linebacker for the Buckeyes, and they've had some good recruiters help with that. Anybody else on defense that you think will make an impact? You and I have talked about Madden before, and I know you're really high on him as well, but anybody else on the defensive side of the ball you think plays as a freshman?
It's a good question. I think that Dallas Golden and Mark Zachary will make their way on the field, but probably on special teams, just because I think they're such good athletes. They're going to be impossible to keep off the field, but they're not going to play over Leonard Moore, and they're not going to play over Christian Gray. And I really like Devontae Smith at nickel. So unless one of those guys gets hurt, I don't really see Golden or Zachary getting many reps on defense, but I do think that they're going to be a factor in their freshman season. I would not be surprised if Burgess Jr. ends up making a name for himself early on. Now, the defensive line situation, specifically the defensive end situation, is very interesting because they've got Boubacar Traore coming back. They've got Jordan Botelho coming back at Viper. And then on the strong side end, Bryce Young looks like he's going to be a star, and I think Josh Burnham is quietly very good. They also have Logan Thomas in there at Viper as well. But Traore and Botelho are coming off very serious knee injuries. So I don't know when they're going to be full go. And I would not be surprised if early on in the season they ask Christopher Burgess Jr. to go out there, and maybe it's just 10 snaps a game. But if he's effective in those snaps, this staff has shown a willingness to play some true freshmen. You and I have both talked about Christopher Burgess before. I'm incredibly high on him. I think that he has a ton of potential. But if he can get himself physically ready to go early on in the season, I could see him making an impact.
I don't know exactly where he's going to play. When I saw those photos of him at the game down in San Antonio, I was like, holy cow, he's put on some it's good weight.
Yeah.
But I don't know if he can still play weak side, maybe strong side, but he's a freaky looking athlete. And that's not a guy that looks like a freshman in college. He looks like he's 23 years old already. So I'm with you. I think he's got a chance to play very, very early. Moving on and looking at some of the different opportunities for Notre Dame. We touched on NIL a minute ago. Do you think that Notre Dame has learned its lessons with NIL and now they kind of know how to utilize it? Obviously, Chad Bowden has moved on and he was kind of helping with that. But are they allocating it not only with the roster to retain guys? I think they do probably as good as anybody with that. But do you think they know how they want to do it going into the year and they're pretty steadfast with it?
I think they have a much better plan than they did before. It felt like at the beginning they were reluctant to do it. And personally, I was very worried about the future of the program. But that changed really quickly. It was kind of interesting to me how the conversation had shifted in such an extreme fashion in a very short amount of time, because when it first started, it did not feel like Notre Dame was willing to really throw their hat in the ring. And then all of a sudden, they were very competitive. They went out and they got Sam Hartman, which we know costs a lot of money. This past cycle, they got multiple guys who definitely warranted some cash. So I think that they have a much better plan in place. But I do think that this revenue sharing thing is going to shake everything up across college football, because I believe it was Greg Sankey, the SEC commissioner, who said, yeah, there's going to be revenue sharing, but there's always going to be sweeteners. We all know what sweeteners is in this situation. So I do think Notre Dame is fully prepared to be competitive. Now they have 2 NIL collectives. The second one actually came out during the season. I believe it's called Rally. That's very intriguing that it's not all going through one source going forward. So they're never going to be Texas. They're never going to be Ohio State, really. One, because there's just not nearly as many alums. Notre Dame, despite the fact that it's a big brand, there's only typically around 8,500 undergrads, whereas like Ohio State, Texas, there's 40 or 50,000 every single year. So there's just a lot more people willing to donate to those schools. And, I'm not trying to say that Notre Dame is ever hurting for money, but I do think that that eventually matters. I do think the most important thing though, is they do have a plan in place, and the buy-in from so many alumni, especially with Marcus Freeman and coming off this run, I think it's as high as it's ever been. So I think they're going to be competitive in the NIL space for a long time.
To your point, and shining off of the playoff run, do you think that Jeremiah Love's shine? He's going to be a Doak Walker candidate. He's going to be almost everybody's All-American preseason next year. Those clips of him going viral, jumping over people, even when he was hurt.
Yeah.
How much do you think Jeremiah Love improves recruiting for Notre Dame? Because it sells when you've got exciting skill players.
It does. And I'm so excited about what he could do next season. But it's also an interesting situation with him, because I was trying to think about this. Like, there's been some famous Notre Dame players in recent years. They've all mostly been quarterbacks. And then there's the linebacker Manti Te'o, who took the world by storm for basically a full year. But when was the last time a Notre Dame skill player was like a true superstar? I think people who really cared about college football understood just how good and how explosive Will Fuller was, but he was not like a superstar in college football. I think Jeremiah Love has that potential. And then when you consider the way that Marcus Freeman has sort of changed the perception around Notre Dame football, I think Jeremiah Love could take it to a whole nother level. So I think it could have a huge impact on recruiting, because if he's making all these flashy plays and he's just racking up the stat sheet, like, he's going to bring a new level of attention to Notre Dame football that we have not really seen since, I don't know, maybe the Rocket, which seems crazy because that's damn near 30 years. But I really think he is that exciting as a football player. And it's interesting hearing people who've covered Notre Dame for a really long time watch Jeremiah Love, and they're like, yeah, we haven't seen someone like him since like Tim Brown. So I really think that he's going to have an impact that carries on well beyond his time at Notre Dame, because I think we can all agree this next season will be his last.
Yeah, senior year, he shall not see a single second of that.
No.
Underrated recruit from the class of 25. Before we get to 26 here in a minute, which kid out of the 25 class do you think has a chance to play? It doesn't have to necessarily be like boom right out of the gate, but who do you think's underrated and why?
I really liked Anthony Sacca. I think he could be a really good player. He comes out of Pennsylvania, went to a really competitive high school. He doesn't quite have the same fanfare as like a Madden or Kingston Viliamu-Asa the year before. So I don't think he's going to come out of the scene and make a name for himself right away. So that's one player on the defense. And Nolan James, he's an interesting player because, he really wasn't on Notre Dame's radar. And the only reason that he got an offer was because he was on the same team as Elijah Burris. And as the coaches were watching Elijah play, they're like, wait a second, who is this running back who's racking up all these stats? And he was just a really good player. Now he's a little bit undersized. It's going to take some time for him to become, a college ready running back. But when I watch him play, he just has this level of grit, and, he doesn't have the traits or the explosiveness of like a Jeremiah Love, but Notre Dame has figured out a way to get running backs who just kind of have that dog in them, a way to get on the field and really excel. So it's probably going to take some time for a guy like Nolan James and Anthony Sacca, but I think that, in a few years, you're going to be talking about them as a guy who's like, wow, like these are the core pieces to a team, even if they're not necessarily the best or most talented players in the roster.
That's a good pick. Sacca, obviously, his dad was a Penn State player. He's been around big-time football, so that's a good pick. For me, it's Koa Kia, the linebacker out of Hawaii, his brother, Notre Dame player. I think he's another guy that's just really sized for the same reasons you said. He does all the little things, and he's a guy that just gets after it. When we come back, we're going to talk about some 26 recruits with Tyler. Super Bowl 59 is here. One game, two teams, endless possibilities. And there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown, calling the MVP, or even betting on the coin toss, FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action. With live betting all game long, you can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from kickoff to final whistle. The live betting feature lets you stay involved no matter what happens on the field, and the app is super easy to navigate. Plus, knowing that you can place a $5 bet and potentially win $200 in bonus bets for the Super Bowl. That's the icing on the cake. Download the app or head over to FanDuel.com to get started. Bet $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, official partner of Super Bowl 59. Tyler, the 26 class has already gotten started a little bit, and instead of focusing on the commitments, which I'm sure most Notre Dame fans probably know a lot about, there are a lot of different recruits that I like. And I obviously I'm a recruiting nut, or I wouldn't have the Portal podcast talking about recruiting 365 days a year. But looking at it at Notre Dame, it's a little harder for Notre Dame to like project because they recruit nationally. I mean, you live out in California, they might get 3 or 4 kids this year from California. They're in on a bunch. It wouldn't be shocking, but it's really hard to pick. Looking at the 26 class, who would you say is like the must-get guy? Either side of the ball, I don't care which position. Who's somebody you're like, man, they put a lot of eggs in this basket. They need to land this dude.
I would say it's not just one guy. I would go with just the wide receiver position in general. I really like Caden Finley a lot. Devin Fitzgerald is a pretty good playmaker as well. And there's another guy, Brayden Robinson. Yes. So they need to hit on like all of those guys. Like they can't afford to put themselves in another position where they're just kind of scrambling at the end of the cycle. The whole thing with Derek Meadows, I mean, I get it. You know, when you looked at Derek Meadows' frame and his speed, there's just not many guys in the Notre Dame roster who have his size and his athletic ability. So I'm very happy to see that Notre Dame is prioritizing wide receivers so early on in this process. I feel like they learned a lot after the way that this last cycle went. So I think you have to lump all those wide receivers together because you and I know, like, wide receiver is a position where you can't just have one guy and count on them. You need multiple guys. And even though there are some players who are going to be sophomores in the roster right now, like Micah Gilbert and Logan Soldate, who, didn't play at all their freshman season really. And I think they have bright futures. I think you just need to keep bringing in more young talent so that you're not living in the portal at wide receiver. Some teams, it works. I think Texas A&M, what they did in the transfer portal at wide receiver this past cycle is very impressive, especially getting Concepcion from NC State. So I think you got to start there. Finley, Fitzgerald, Robinson, they got to focus on those 3 guys. They already got Dylan Faison, who's a superstar athlete, but they need some pure receivers. And I think that, getting those 3 guys on board would be absolutely huge for this class.
Let me add in, I was going to say Brayden Robinson and Trent Mosley. Mosley's father played at Notre Dame. Connor Solomon, kid from Virginia, it's a 10-4 guy. Either one of those would be great additions. Mosley won MVP of the Trinity League as a sophomore. That's about all I need to know about him. I mean, you live out there. Like that's right. Not normal, bro. That's not normal. So after the must-get recruit, just a couple more for you. Defensive back. I mean, what Notre Dame has done at DB the last 3-4 years is pretty ridiculous. Who's the defensive back that you think they like? It's got to be harder now because the room is not exactly in the shambles that it was. For me, it's Joey O'Brien because he's at least flexible. He's a kid out of LaSalle in the Philly area that's really, really good. And they've had him on campus. A lot of people think they're going to get him. Is there anybody I'm missing here? Because they're in on a bunch of guys, but I'm not sure if there's one like at corner right now. I'm like, they're going to get this guy. Usually by now, they've got 2 or 3 that are right there. They got 1 committed, but there's usually 2 or 3 more. Anybody you'd like to throw out there, or is it just too early?
Well, I would say it is interesting that they only have, I think, 7 commits in the class because at this time last year, Notre Dame had the number 1 class in the country. And a big reason why is because they had a lot more commitments than everyone else. So I wonder if that's just a product of the guys that they're recruiting are not ready to commit, or if this is a shift in strategy for the program overall, because, their plan before was get in on guys early, get them to commit, and then just hold on to them. But then last year, I guess maybe with the way that finished, they're a little bit reluctant to go that route. But to get back to your question about the defensive backs, I love Joey O'Brien. I think safety is a huge need in this class because they have Golden, they have Zachary in this class from last year. So they're probably pretty good. I mean, they obviously are going to take some guys, and Leonard Moore being a true freshman going into his sophomore season, who's the clear starter these next 2 seasons, it's going to make it a little bit harder to get some of those really high-end guys who want to come in and play right away. But I think Nick Hankins is pretty good. I think he was on campus for junior day. I'm I'm to the point now, and you and I have talked about this before. Like if Mike Mickens offers a guy, I'm like, all right, he's awesome. Like what? I don't even need to see. I don't even need to like watch film. I'm just like, okay, Mike Mickens, if he just extends an offer to a player, I am ready to say that guy is good. Now, Notre Dame does have a cornerback commit right now, Chasten Smith, who by all accounts is probably going to decommit here in short order. USC is already considered a potential landing spot for him, so maybe he ends up following Chad Bowden. But I would say Nick Hakens, and then there was Giles, who's on campus as well for junior day. I think those guys, either one of them could be good, but I think safety is the most important spot for Notre Dame's defensive backs.
That's why I picked Joey, because he's 6'3"-ish and he moves pretty well. I don't know if he could play pure corner in a cover one system like Notre Dame runs, but in cover three, I think he could. And he's still a slinky back there. He can move really, really well. So he's an important recruit. Defensive line, my answer, and I'm probably going to butcher how you say this name. It's a kid from your area, Samote Katatunga. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. J. Sarah Catholic. That's another one of those schools out where it's always really good. He's an edge guy now. He could grow into a 3-tech, but he's just really freaking good. Notre Dame's got a shot. SC and Texas and all these other schools are trying to get him. Who's your D lineman that they need to get?
Ebenezer, I think is his name. I haven't heard that name in a really long time. I think maybe that's part of it too, is his name just stands out to me. Dakota Dixon is good at D tackle too. I just think they need D tackles so badly in this class. And I think when they went out and they got Elijah Hughes in the transfer portal, that was an interesting move because you're definitely projecting there. He'd been at USC for a couple of years, didn't really do much, but he didn't redshirt either one of those years, played for more than 4 games. So it's like you got a lot of raw potential there. And it does seem like that's kind of how Notre Dame is approaching it at defensive tackle, which, you and I could criticize, but it does kind of go back to dollars and cents. So maybe early on they're prioritizing another player who they feel they can get on board early. Tiki Hola is another guy who, and it's difficult, man. And I think that, depending on what happens with James Blanchard, who at the time of this recording is still undecided about whether or not he's going to be the Notre Dame general manager. But the biggest thing about him is his Texas roots. So I would not be surprised if he came on board and then just kind of not like shut down the whole board, but was like, we need to start prioritizing Texas players. I'd be more than fine with it. And I think Tiki Hola would be one of those guys where it's like, oh, now all of a sudden the game has changed here. They might really prioritize him more than they were before.
That's a really good football player out of East Texas. And they've had an eye on him for quite a while. I don't know what started that, but he's a guy that they were after for a long time. So that's a good call. Last question for you here. And this is something you kind of touched on just a little bit. Do you think that Notre Dame is going to wait it out more? You brought this up because they kind of started a little slower, but it's not like they're not bringing guys on campus. And a reason for that, do you think they're going to try to wait out for some more elite recruits, especially after the deep playoff run?
I do. I think that the way that this last year's class finished, I think honestly just might have changed everything for Notre Dame because I do believe that Marcus Freeman was pretty upset with the fact that they were in scramble mode. And it wasn't just, with the high end guys, like the fact that, they had 2 running backs committed that they just had to walk away from because simply put, they weren't players. And that's a miss on the eval. So I think with the way that went down, the way that the Derek Meadows situation, how that kind of all just unraveled there. Ivan Taylor ended up decommitting and then committing to Michigan and then flipping to Alabama. I think that Freeman understands that, hey, like it's not going to be super fun having to wait until that last month and even, into the final weeks with these guys. But those are the players that Notre Dame is after. And I think that they're going to adjust their strategy to the point where they can really put themselves in a good position to land those high-end guys. And if it requires waiting until the last couple of weeks of the cycle, I think they are more than willing to do that now than they did before. And I think part of that is because they feel like they have put themselves in a position to really land those guys. And a big part of that goes to the fact that not only did they make a deep run in the college football playoff, but they were like the talk of college football. Marcus Freeman specifically. There's not really many superstars in college football because the players are typically playing like 3 years or 4 years max, and then they're gone. So it's typically the coaches. And a lot of the great college football coaches are gone. Like Urban Meyer is retired. Jim Harbaugh is in the NFL. Nick Saban is retired. So you got Kirby Smart, you got Dabo Sweeney, you got Ryan Day. I think Marcus Freeman is going to be right at their level here pretty soon. And in terms of like superstardom, he is going to be right there at the top. And I think that plays a big factor with these super high caliber recruits.
Tyler, that is a great ending point. Thank you very much for joining. Tell everybody where they can find your work.
You can listen to me every day. Locked On Irish. You can follow me on Twitter at Tyler Wojciak. So even though it's the off season, we're still coming at you with daily episodes covering Notre Dame all year long.
I appreciate it, sir. You can find this everywhere you get your podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, and everywhere else. Like, subscribe, and share this podcast. We will see you again soon on The Port.